It's time for this week's edition of Talk Back. I'm one of your hosts, Eric Nesbit, and with me is Justin Gay, your host and director of content. We've got a full lineup of not only NFL, but NBA and a World Series champion. There's a lot of news, including Steph Curry injured for the Golden State Warriors, people fighting on the court, and who is the best team in the NBA right now. We've got all of that and more on this episode of Talk Back. Are you ready for a show that talks sports from the fans' point of view?
We've seen Michael Jordan score 37 points a game in his era. How many could he score in today's NBA?
There's not a player out there who I'd rather have than LeBron James.
Are you ready for a show that isn't afraid to challenge anyone when it comes to sports? If Adam Silver really wanted to fix tanking in the NBA, he would stop rewarding teams by giving them the best chance to win the draft lottery.
I mean, how many times will Roger Goodell drop the ball on handling domestic violence in the NFL?
Look, athletes have every right to talk politics, but if the fans stop tuning in, that's their right.
Then you're ready for Talk Back, a podcast where two fans debate the media narrative and discuss the world of sports as we see it.
Welcome to the show. Well, Eric, this might be a first for us. I don't believe in the history of the show we've opened in the first segment with baseball. But as we record this super early on Thursday morning, coming off the World Series Game 7, the Nationals with the big upset over the Astros, I think we have to talk about this because I don't think going back and looking at the offseason and what happened to the Nationals, watching Bryce Harper run off to a rival in the Phillies, and to think that this team would have an opportunity to make this kind of a run and win the World Series, but that's exactly what they did, and they got through the vaunted Astros and that pitching staff. So, Eric, I got to ask you, baseball's already had an issue with contracts. We've seen there's just a ton of free agents that sit out there. They've gone to this youth movement. There's all kinds of rules with how baseball's rookie deals work, and then guys going into arbitration, and by the time they're free agents, sometimes they're either just outside that window of their prime or past it at this point. Now the Nationals, they let Bryce Harper basically walk. They didn't match the Phillies deal. They had their price set. Harper leaves, and then this team turns around and wins the World Series in spite of all this that's going on. So from a larger standpoint, before we kind of get into it, how do you think this is going to affect the game of baseball with what the Nationals were able to do despite losing Bryce Harper?
Well, it's no secret that our listeners know we don't follow baseball for 162 games or whatever it is throughout the regular season as closely as we do the NFL, the NBA, certainly NASCAR, PGA Tour, some of the sports that drive our TV watching and our patterns of keeping up with stats, everything else. And baseball just doesn't do that for us. However, in postseason baseball, I think we're both relatively interested, and the past couple of years have been exciting. We've seen teams like the Astros a couple years ago win a World Series, the Cubs, the Royals, teams that really the parity keeps it interesting. So from the initial part of your question, I think for me, and having no vested interest in the World Series as far as the Astros or the Nationals, I don't root for either of those teams. In this particular World Series, I was rooting for the Nationals. I think the parity is good for the sport. So now we've seen yet another team win a World Series for the first time in the last decade, let's say, with, where we've been with the teams I just mentioned. I think to me, that is good for the sport. Now, certainly the Astros, their last one was only 2 years ago. And then prior to that, it had been forever and a day. So I don't think the Astros winning would have been detrimental in any way to the sport, especially for the way that they've built that team. They've really built that team the right way over the past 5 to 6 years. And a lot of sports writers have been predicting that the Astros would be this good, that this time would come. So I think that's really where baseball's at. And to your second question and the point about Bryce Harper, you and I have made this point many times on this show that one of the things that keeps us away from baseball is the fact that these players, these single team members, really out of a 25, 26 man roster, you're going to pay one guy $400 or $300 or $200 million. And it just doesn't have the same impact, I don't think, as it does in other sports. So I think this is a good case of really the argument against paying one of those superstars like the Phillies did or the Padres did or whatever. And we've named the past teams that have done that. I just like what the Nationals have done because it shows you that baseball, maybe more than any other sport, can be driven by team play. You saw the Nationals pull off last night in that Game 7. You saw the Nationals pull off a successful bunt. You saw some opposite field hitting. I thought they did it with baseball technique rather than, well, we've got one guy in the lineup that we've paid this much money for, and we hope that there's guys on base and we hope that he can do something when he's up to bat. I just think baseball, it doesn't make sense to me, Justin. We've talked about it a couple times where why are you going to pay one guy in maybe the hardest sport in the world offensively to count on him to do something on? I mean, if you bat 300 in baseball, you're a Hall of Famer. Well, that's 3 out of 10 times. So in a World Series, let's say, if they had Bryce Harper and he strikes out, 3 out of 4 times he's at the plate or doesn't get a hit, and then the other time is just a single, is that $400 million worth it? No, I'd rather have a strong lineup like the Nationals have, as well as a strong pitching staff, and do what they did. So to me, I think this is actually an argument for what we've been saying all along, that I'd rather let those guys walk. I mean, did the Phillies get as far as the Nationals? No. So here we are. The Padres, Machado sitting at home, Harper sitting at home. All those guys are sitting at home while the Nationals play team ball and win the World Series.
And I think the Nationals did it in an interesting way because they aren't like these teams we've seen where the Marlins jump up or the Royals jump up and they win and then they completely dismantle the team because they decided, okay, we're all in for 1 year. The Nationals wanted Bryce Harper. They offered him a big deal. He just wanted to go get more money and it seemed like he wanted out of Washington. So it's not like they just were smart enough from a baseball mind or analytical standpoint to be like, nope, we're not going to offer them. They still offered him a chunk of money. And they've reportedly got a 7-year, $200+ million deal on the table for Rendon. So maybe they haven't learned their lesson. But I think when you look at their roster, the fact that 3 of their top paid guys in terms of average salary are Scherzer, Strasburg, and Corbett. And then Sanchez isn't far down the list. So they've went more with the starting pitching. And I think that's a lot smarter because to your point, and we talked about this even when Harper signed, if you don't have good people around them to protect them, then you can be pitched around. We saw Barry Bonds get pitched around for years and would literally get 2 or 3 pitches a night to hit. And that was what made him so unbelievable, his run, because he could still make an impact on the game, only seeing 2 or 3 decent hittable pitches. So I think more along the lines of what they did with their pitching staff. And you saw with the Astros as well, where you have 3 studs and those guys can have an impact because they can go 6, 7, 8 innings and set your team up to get a win. You're paying $30 million to a guy that may get 4 at bats and could get walked twice and be pitched around and then start to get into that mindset of, oh my God, I'm not really performing, start chasing bad pitches. And I think Harper went through that early in the season, Eric, when we were talking about him and hitting under 250. I think at one point halfway through, he was at like 248. I think that gets in these guys' mind. I'm making $30 million a year. The media's wondering what I'm doing. The team's not winning. The team I left is doing better than all those components come in. So I do think that the days of seeing the big positional contracts are going to be few and far between. It's going to have to be somebody like Trout that's proved that he's able to seemingly do this stuff similar in that Bonds where he can have an impact on the game, even though there's not a lot around him. And look, the Angels haven't won anything. I mean, that's the one reason he's not a bigger name because he doesn't get to play when all eyes are on him. So I do think from that standpoint, those position player big contracts there, I think they're in the past. I think pitchers, they'll still get paid because again, you can roll them out there every 5 days. They can have a direct impact on your win-loss record. They can have an impact on 25, 30, 35 games. And if you have 2 or 3 of those guys, now you're up to 60% of your season where you have a chance to win games. and then you can fill in with other guys. So I think when you look at what baseball has done, the next time their CBA is up, they have to address the whole rookie deal thing. I think that's really screwed up baseball, and I think that's something we can get into later. But the fact that they get these guys when they come out, they're locked in for 7 years ago. Like somebody like Trey Turner, as good as he is, he's not going to hit free agency until he's like 29 years old. I mean, that's just ridiculous. We go nuts in football about running backs and that these guys can't hit it to market after 4 years. These guys get locked up until their late 20s. So I think from that standpoint, baseball's just got some rules they've got to change. They've got to figure out a way to get more stars on teams. You can't just have it where in a couple years, like Soto's sitting out there and he can't get signed because everybody wants the young guy. Nobody wants to pay him. I just think baseball's got a lot of issues. And look, it's still not the most exciting game in the world to watch. I mean, it's just not. It's just, there's no real ebb and flow. You start getting into the pitching changes. I mean, last night was a game 7. Yeah, that's fine. But like the other games, Eric, there's just still something missing from the pace of baseball that I think they've got to figure out a way to fix.
I agree. And that's one of the things that, look, I tell my friends who say that they're huge baseball fans, I have absolutely no incentive in May or June or July for that matter to sit down and pull up TBS or TNT or whatever channel baseball might still be on and watch the 63rd game of the season that's going to take 4 hours that has no ebb and flow. And it's like you could go 2 or 3 hours if it's a 1-0 game or 0-0 game with like nothing happening. So the playoff baseball to me, because of the crowds, because of the way that it's presented, I do feel like there's something with playoff baseball that's different. And the crowds have a lot to do with it in my mind and what's at stake. Last night's game was really good in terms of there were some dead moments, but you had that 2-0 lead for the Astros for quite a while there. Then the Nationals finally hit 2 home runs to take a 3-2 lead. Then they blow it open with good baseball. In the 7th inning, they move a base runner around, get a single, score him. It's 4-2. And they just show you that teamwork that we were just talking about where one hitter can't make all the difference. But in the regular season, you're right. There's just nothing there to really watch and to keep track of. So I think baseball does have a big problem. And does this Nationals-Astros series move the needle? Maybe temporarily. But Justin, I think to your point with the contracts, with not having a lot of household names, I think it's great that we can talk about the World Series and talk about the Nationals winning their first and all of that stuff on this show. But, come the next couple of episodes, we're not going to be talking baseball again. So,
no, and even for us, like when you're watching these games outside of the play in Game 6 that really ended up not mattering because the Nationals homered and they ended up winning the game and ultimately the series, that was the only play that a show like ours or even more of the debate shows or sports talk radio could even have a debatable conversation about, because there was nothing else that really happened. There really wasn't any horrific moves by the managers. So you just have a kind of a freakish play. Was he in the baseline? Was he out of the base path? Did he make contact? Like, that's the only thing that we could even debate. Outside of that, like, what are we going to talk about? Like, Steven Strasburg was really good in Game 6. Matt Scherzer was really good in Game 7. Maybe did they pull Greinke too early? Baseball doesn't lend itself like the NFL where you have constant content like the NBA. The NBA had a night, the same night as Game 7, Eric, and there's more news out of the NBA in teams' 3rd and 4th games than what we got out of the World Series Game 7.
Right.
There's more debatable topics for us to spend time on with the Embiid fight and Steph breaking his hand, all that stuff that we'll have in segment 2 is probably more interesting content than trying to break down at bats or Scherzer's pitch count or whatever. So I think that's the other problem with baseball is there's just not a lot to be able to debate. There's not stories day in, day out because the season's such a long grind. And unless it's something freakish like a big brawl, and even then, what are we going to talk about? Like the unwritten rules of baseball. Should he have thrown at a guy? I mean, should Bregman have carried his bat down to first? Should Soto have done it? Well, how are we going to debate that kind of stuff? So I think that's the other problem with baseball is it doesn't lend itself to be able to stay in the spotlight. And for us in a show like ours, when we come back for the next show, we're not going to be talking baseball. We're just not. Unless there's some kind of crazy contract that comes out for someone, that's the only time we'll talk about it. So